The ventilator on bed 6 had been cycling at 14 breaths per minute for the last 3 hours, and Casey Merritt had been listening to every single one of them. Not consciously. Not the way a new nurse listens, counting and recounting, checking the digital readout against the rhythm. Casey listened the way a woman listens to rain on a roof she has slept under for years. She heard the pattern. She would hear the break. The ICU at Bethesda Naval Medical Center was never silent, not even at 03:47 on a Tuesday morning. Monitors chirped their soft, persistent language. Somewhere down the corridor, a floor buffer hummed against linoleum that had been polished 10,000 times and would never look clean. The building smelled the way all military hospitals smell, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that nobody ever named but every patient recognized. Waiting. The building smelled like waiting. Casey stood at the nursing station charting vitals on Staff Sergeant Daniel Okafor, Bed 9, 3rd floor, East Wing. Both legs in external fixation frames. IED outside Fallujah, 6 days prior. She wrote the numbers with a pen that had a chewed cap and ink that was starting to skip. And she did not think about the fact that the man in Bed 9 was 23 years old and would never run again. She thought about his potassium levels instead. They were trending low. Her badge read LTC Merit, RN. The photograph on it showed a woman with brown eyes and dark hair pulled back so tight it could have belonged to anyone. She wore the same blue scrubs as every other nurse on the floor. She moved through the ward with the particular economy of someone who has learned that efficiency is a form of kindness, that the fastest hands cause the least pain. She was reaching for the phone to page the on-call resident about the potassium when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. Not the half-second stutter that happened twice a month when the building's aging electrical grid reminded everyone it had been installed during the Reagan administration. Everything, all of it, gone. The monitors died mid-chirp. The ventilator on bed 6 stopped breathing. The floor buffer down the corridor wound down to silence with a sound like a question nobody finished asking. Total darkness, the kind that has weight. Casey's hand was still on the phone receiver. She set it down. Her fingers found the pen-like clip to her breast pocket, and she did not turn it on. She counted. 1, 2. The emergency generators caught on 3. Red backup lighting flooded the corridor in the color of something that has gone wrong, and the ventilator on bed 6 resumed its rhythm, and the monitors began their startup sequences with a cascade of electronic complaints. 3 seconds. Casey stood very still at the nursing station and did not move. 3 seconds of total blackout in a military hospital meant the primary power had been cut at the source. Not tripped, cut. The generators were on a separate system, and they had performed exactly as designed, which meant someone had known they would, which meant someone had accounted for the 3-second window and decided it was enough. Enough for what? She pressed herself against the wall beside Okafor's bed before she made the conscious decision to do so. Her body had answered a question her mind was still forming. Down the corridor, below her, 1 floor down, possibly 2. Boots on hard flooring. Multiple sets. The cadence was wrong for hospital security, and wrong for a code response, and wrong for anything that belonged in this building at this hour. She counted footsteps the way she had counted ventilator breaths. Spacing. Weight distribution. The particular rhythm of men who have been trained to move through a structure they intend to own. 10, maybe 11. Her hand went to her hip and found the fabric of scrubs. Nothing else. She exhaled once through her nose. Adapt. There were things about Casey Merritt that lived in rooms she would never enter. Deep inside the Naval Personnel Command in Millington, Tennessee, in a server farm kept at 62 degrees and monitored by people who did not make small talk, her full service record existed in a file that required 2 separate authorization codes and a biometric scan to access. The file was 11 pages long. The version available to Bethesda's administrative staff was 3. The missing 8 pages contained a different woman. SEAL Team 8, 7 years. 4 combat deployments across 3 theaters of operation. She had entered the pipeline at 21, one of the first women to complete the full Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman qualification before crossing into a joint Special Operations medical program, so obscure it did not have a name anyone used in conversation. It had a designator code. It had fewer than a dozen graduates. It produced people who could perform a cricothyrotomy in a drainage ditch under fire and then clear a room 30 seconds later. Casey had been one of the best. Her commanding officer at Team 8, a man named Commander David Harlow, who had since retired to a quiet life in Annapolis that was not as quiet as it appeared, had written her final evaluation in language that was remarkable for its restraint. Harlow was not a man who gave compliments. He gave assessment. His assessment of Casey Merritt read, in part, "Merritt operates best when nobody is watching her. She does not seek recognition. She does not require external validation to maintain operational effectiveness." In 12 years of leading special operations personnel, I have not encountered another operator whose instinct for situational awareness is so thoroughly integrated into their resting state. She does not turn it on, she does not turn it off, she simply sees. The evaluation also contained a single line that Harlow had added by hand, in ink, below his signature. This was unusual. Harlow did not annotate. The line read, "Do not waste her." The Navy, in its infinite and occasionally accidental wisdom, had not wasted her. It had done something stranger. It had allowed her to leave the teams and retrain as a critical care nurse, which she had requested after her 4th deployment for reasons the record did not specify, and Casey did not discuss. The reasons lived in a place between her sternum and her spine, in the particular way she sometimes paused before entering a dark room, in the fact that she had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours since a night in Helmand Province, that had earned her a commendation nobody could publicly acknowledge. The commendation was classified. The action was classified. The names of the people involved were classified. What was not classified, because it could not be contained by any security protocol, was the way Casey's hands sometimes trembled at 0300 hours, when the ward was quiet, and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that reminded her of something she could not allow herself to remember. She had chosen nursing because she wanted to keep people alive, without having to decide who died first. She had chosen Bethesda because it was full of people who understood that some questions were not asked. She had chosen the night shift because the darkness was easier when she was working in it. None of this was available to the 10 men currently moving through the hospital's lower floors. They had done their reconnaissance. They had studied staff rotations, security protocols, the placement of cameras, and the response time of the base police force. They had identified every armed person in the building and neutralized them with a precision that spoke to months of planning and the kind of funding that does not come from desperate people. They had planned for guards. They had planned for locked doors and alarmed stairwells and the possibility of a rapid reaction force from the base. They had not planned for Casey Merritt. There was no reason they should have. She was a nurse on the night shift. She weighed 138 pounds. She was holding a penlight and wearing soft-soled shoes. She was the most dangerous person in the building. There were 41 patients on the 3rd floor of Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and Casey Merritt knew every single one of them by name. She knew which ones could walk. She knew which ones could breathe on their own. She knew which ones would die if their ventilators lost power for longer than 90 seconds, and she knew that the backup generators feeding those ventilators were running on diesel reserves that nobody had topped off since Tuesday. She did this math in approximately 4 seconds while crouched beside Daniel Okafor's bed in the red half-light of the emergency system, listening to 10 men move through the floor below her with the kind of disciplined spacing that meant they had done this before. 12 immobile, 6 on ventilators, 3 in post-surgical recovery who could not be moved without opening wounds that would kill them faster than anything those men were carrying, 14 ambulatory patients, most of them missing pieces of themselves they had left in Fallujah or Kandahar, or places that didn't have names on any map their families would ever see, 2 nurses on shift besides herself, 1 orderly, a respiratory therapist named Gutierrez, who was probably in the break room on the 2nd floor and who was probably already zip-tied or worse, 41 patients, and her. She moved to Okafor's bed. He was already sitting up, or trying to. The external fixators on both legs made the motion grotesque, all that steel and swollen flesh grinding against itself, but his face showed nothing except the flat alertness of a man whose body remembered what his legs could no longer do. "You are infantry," she said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you sit up all the way?" "Can try." She watched him do it, watched the sweat break across his forehead and the cords in his neck pull taut, and the way his hands gripped the bed rail with the kind of force that bends metal. He got himself upright, and his breathing was wrong, but his eyes were steady. "I need your help," she said. "Can you follow instructions exactly?" He looked at her then, really looked, and whatever he saw in her face in that red emergency light made him stop being a patient and start being something else. Something older. Something he had not been since the IED took his legs out from under him, on a road outside Fallujah, that he could still smell when he closed his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, differently this time. She pulled the IV line from his arm with a motion so clean he barely felt the needle leave. She pressed a gauze pad over the site and guided his hand to hold it. Then she reached past him and lifted the steel IV pole from its wheeled base. It was 5 feet of hollow stainless steel with a weighted bottom, and it weighed about 4 pounds. And in the hands of a man who could not stand up, it was not much. It was more than nothing. She placed it across his lap. "Stay here. Do not move unless I tell you to move. If someone comes through that door who is not me, you do whatever you have to do." She paused. "You never saw me." He opened his mouth to ask the question that every patient and every nurse and every doctor in this hospital would have asked if they had seen what was happening behind her eyes in that moment. The question that had no good answer and that she did not have time to hear. "Who are you?" But she was already through the door and into the corridor, moving low along the wall with her shoes off and her feet silent on the cold linoleum, and the red light made her shadow stretch and contract against the ceiling, like something that had never been entirely human. Behind her, Daniel Okafor sat in his bed, holding a steel pole across his ruined legs, and staring at the door she had disappeared through, and knowing with the absolute certainty of a man who had served 3 combat tours that the woman who had just removed his IV was not a nurse. Or she was not only a nurse. Their leader moved like a man who had stopped being afraid a long time ago. Vasquez came through the east stairwell door with his weapon up and his breathing even, and the 2 men behind him flowed into the corridor like they had rehearsed it 1,000 times. They had, not here, not in this building, but in buildings enough like it that the geometry was already solved in their bodies before their minds caught up. He was 43 years old. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and he had stopped noticing it in mirrors the way most people stop noticing the color of their own front door. He wore black tactical gear with no insignia, no flag, no unit patch, nothing that could be photographed and traced. His boots were commercial, his gloves were commercial, his weapon was a suppressed H&K MP7 that had been purchased through a chain of transactions so long that the serial number pointed to a sporting goods warehouse in the Czech Republic that had burned down 11 months ago. He spoke into his throat mic, quiet, controlled. "Ground floor secure, 2nd floor secure, moving to 3. The response came back clipped. "Copy. Timeline is 14 minutes. 14 minutes. That was the window between the power cut and the moment someone at the Naval District Washington watch desk would override the communications blackout his tech team had layered over the building. 14 minutes before the outside world knew anything was wrong. He had used 9 already. The 4th floor was the target. General Marcus Webb, 61 years old, recovering from a triple bypass in a private suite that was supposed to be guarded by 4 armed Naval Security Force personnel. Those 4 men were currently unconscious in a utility corridor 2 floors below, flex-cuffed and breathing, but not a factor. His insertion team had handled them with chemical agents delivered through the ventilation system of their guard station. They never drew their weapons. They never touched their radios. They simply sat down and stopped being conscious, one after another, like candles going out in a draft. Webb was the last living witness to a weapons transfer that had taken place 14 months ago in a port city on the eastern coast of Libya. The transfer had involved American military hardware moving to destinations that would end careers, collapse alliances, and trigger congressional investigations that 3 very powerful people could not afford. 2 other witnesses had already died, one in a car accident in Frankfurt that the German police had closed as mechanical failure, one from a cerebral hemorrhage in a VA hospital in San Diego that had been attributed to a pre-existing condition. Webb had survived because Webb was paranoid, and because Webb was in a military hospital surrounded by armed guards. The guards were no longer a factor. Vasquez did not think about the morality of what he was doing. He had passed through that particular checkpoint years ago and found nothing on the other side worth going back for. He thought about geometry, sight lines, timing, the weight of the trigger under his index finger, which was always the same weight, which was the most reliable thing in his life. He paused at the 3rd floor landing. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way civilians meant it. Not a feeling. Not intuition. A specific, quantifiable absence. His second team had entered through the ground floor loading dock and was supposed to have cleared the 3rd floor ward and reported in 90 seconds ago. Silence. He keyed his mic. Bravo team, status. Nothing. Bravo team, report. The stairwell was concrete and steel, and the sound of his own breathing came back to him off the walls. Somewhere above him, a ventilation unit cycled on with a low mechanical hum. Somewhere below him, a door settled against its frame with a click that could have been anything. He looked at the man behind him. The man looked back. Neither of them spoke. Vasquez adjusted his grip on the MP7 and pushed through the 3rd floor door. The corridor was empty. The red emergency lighting made everything the color of old blood. He moved forward. 5 minutes left. Casey moved through the hospital like she was born in it. She wasn't. But she had memorized the floor plans her 2nd week on staff. Not because anyone asked her to. Because that was what she did. She learned the geometry of every building she slept in, every building she worked in, every building where the people she was responsible for drew breath. Old habits, the kind that kept you alive in places where the architecture wanted to kill you. The stairwell between the 3rd and 2nd floors smelled like industrial disinfectant and old copper. She descended barefoot. Her nursing clogs were in a supply closet on the 3rd floor, placed neatly beside a mop bucket where they would not be found quickly and would not make a sound that could be attributed to movement. She had removed them 11 seconds after leaving Okafor's bedside. Bare feet on linoleum. Quieter than any tactical boot ever made. She paused at the 2nd floor landing and pressed her back against the cinder block wall. Listened. The generators hummed through the bones of the building, a low electrical thrum that masked small sounds and amplified large ones. She used it. Filtered through it the way she had once filtered through the white noise of helicopter rotors to isolate the sound of a rifle bolt cycling 300 meters out. 2 men, standing post at the junction where the 2nd floor corridor met the east wing. She could hear the particular creak of load-bearing equipment on torsos, the faint click of a radio squelch, They were holding position, which meant they were rear security, which meant the main element had already moved up. Fourth floor. Webb. She had maybe 12 minutes before they reached him. Maybe less, depending on how many locked doors they had already bypassed and whether the hospital's internal security protocols had triggered any secondary barriers. She suspected they hadn't. The power cut had been too clean. Someone had given these men the building's nervous system before they ever set foot inside it. Inside job, at least partially. She filed that away and kept moving. The second-floor utility corridor was 30 meters ahead and to the left. She had restocked supply carts from it 100 times. She knew its contents the way a surgeon knew an instrument tray, and she knew something else about it that Vasquez and his men almost certainly did not. The utility corridor connected to the building's original pneumatic tube system, decommissioned in 2014, sealed at most access points, but not all of them. The tube infrastructure ran vertically through the building's interior walls. The main shaft was 22 inches in diameter. Casey Merritt had a 21-inch shoulder span. She had never mentioned this to anyone. There had never been a reason to. She reached the utility corridor door and stopped. Through the narrow window she could see them. Two of the hospital's security detail, flex-cuffed and slumped against the far wall. Unconscious, but breathing. She watched their chests rise and fall for 3 seconds to confirm, then assessed the rest of the space. Empty. The rear guard had moved on. She slipped inside, stepped over the bound men carefully, moved to the back wall where a metal panel marked maintenance access sat flush with the cinder block. 4 Phillips head screws. She needed a tool. She looked down at the unconscious guards. One of them wore a badge clip on his belt. Metal, flat head edge. It wasn't a screwdriver, it was close enough. She knelt and went to work on the first screw. Her hands did not shake. They had not shaken in the Helmand province, when she had performed a needle decompression on a collapsed lung while taking fire from 2 positions. They did not shake now. 4 screws. 40 seconds. The panel came free and she set it silently against the wall. The shaft opened in front of her like a throat. Dark, vertical. 22 inches of nothing between her and the 4th floor. She exhaled once. Controlled. Then she folded herself into the wall and disappeared. The stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors was a concrete shaft that smelled of industrial cleaner and old copper pipes. Casey pressed her back against the cold wall at the landing and controlled her breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The way she'd been taught in a place that didn't exist on any map she could point to. She had the scalpel in her right hand and the syringe of succinylcholine in her left. One for close work, one for silence. Above her, she could hear them. 2 men on the 4th floor landing. She could tell by the way their weight shifted that they were facing the stairwell door, not the stairs themselves. Guarding the entrance to Webb's floor, expecting a breach from the corridor, not from below. That was their first mistake. She removed her shoes, set them against the wall without sound. The concrete was ice against her bare feet, but it gave her something boots never could. She could feel the texture of every step, could distribute her weight across the ball of each foot with a precision that made her footfalls indistinguishable from the building settling in the cold. She went up. 1 step every 3 seconds. Weight on the outside edges. Shoulders below the railing line. The red emergency lighting threw long shadows upward, and she stayed inside them, moving when the generator hummed its loudest, pausing in the gaps between mechanical breaths. 14 steps between the 3rd floor landing and the turn. She counted each one. At the turn she stopped and listened. One of them was chewing gum. She could hear the faint wet click of his jaw working. The other was breathing through his mouth, shallow and fast. Nervous. The gum chewer was calm. He would be the more dangerous one. She thought about Okafor downstairs, sitting in the dark with a steel pole across his shattered legs, guarding a door because a nurse he'd never met had asked him to. She thought about the woman in bed 7, whose ventilator was running on backup power that had maybe 40 minutes left. She thought about the 17 patients between here and the ground floor, who could not run, could not hide, could not fight. She did not think about fear. Fear was a chemical event, and she had learned years ago to let it pass through her body like weather. It came. It went. What remained was the task. The gum chewer shifted his weight. Leather creaked. He was leaning against the wall now, his center of gravity committed to his left side. She catalogued this the way she catalogued a patient's vitals. Automatically. Completely. She came around the corner low and fast. The nervous one saw her first. His eyes went wide and his mouth opened, and she was already inside his reach. The syringe went into the lateral neck, depressing the plunger as it entered. Succinylcholine works in seconds. His body understood what was happening before his brain could form the word for it. She caught his weapon as his fingers went slack and guided his weight against the wall so he slid down quietly. The gum chewer was faster than she expected. He got his hand on her wrist and twisted. The scalpel clattered to the concrete. His other hand came up with a knife, a short, fixed blade, and he drove it toward her throat with the economy of someone who had done this before. She let his momentum carry him forward, redirected his wrist, used the railing as a fulcrum, and folded his arm backward until she heard the sound a joint makes when it goes past its architecture. He grunted, but did not scream. Professional. She respected that in the half-second before she put him unconscious, with a chokehold that she held for exactly 7 seconds. She picked up the scalpel, retrieved the spent syringe and pocketed it, took the gum chewer's radio and earpiece and fitted it into her own ear. Spanish. Clipped. Vasquez checking positions. She opened the 4th floor door. The 4th floor was different. Casey felt it the moment she came through the stairwell door. The air was colder here, recycled through a separate HVAC system that served the cardiac recovery wing. It smelled like betadine and cold metal and something else, the particular stillness of a floor where every patient was one complication away from coding. She had 11 minutes, maybe less. Vasquez had split his team. She knew this because she'd been counting bodies since the lights went out and the math no longer added up on 3. At least 4 men had never been on her floor at all. They had gone straight to 4 while the others locked down the building below. General Marcus Webb was in room 417. She knew this the way every nurse in the building knew it, not because anyone had told them, but because the security detail that normally sat outside his door drank too much coffee from the 3rd floor break room and never cleaned up after themselves. That detail was gone now, zip-tied in a utility corridor 2 floors down, if the radio chatter she'd overheard from the man in the pharmacy was accurate. She moved along the east wall. Lights were on up here. The cardiac wing had its own backup generator, independent from the main system. That meant she was visible. It also meant they were visible. She heard them before she saw them. 2 voices. Low. Portuguese, not Spanish. She'd been wrong about Vasquez's accent downstairs. Or these were different men from a different pipeline entirely. One was positioned at the T-junction, where the corridor split toward the private recovery suites. The other was closer, just around the corner from the nurses' station. Casey stopped. She was barefoot. She had removed her shoes in the stairwell between 2 and 3 because rubber soles squeaked on waxed linoleum and bare feet did not. Her scrub top was dark with someone else's blood from the encounter on the 3rd floor. She carried nothing except a syringe of succinylcholine she had drawn from the anesthesia cart and capped with steady fingers, while a man with a fractured trachea gurgled on the floor behind her. She thought about Okafor downstairs, holding an IV pole like a weapon, trusting her without knowing why. She thought about the 41 patients on 3 who were breathing right now because she had decided they would keep breathing. She did not think about what she was going to do next. She had stopped thinking about it 6 floors ago. Her body knew. Her training knew. The part of her that had spent 7 years in places where hesitation was death, that part had been awake since the first boot hit the corridor, and it was not going back to sleep. The man at the nurse's station turned the corner. He was good. She could see it in the way he carried his weight, the way his weapon sat against his chest, the way his eyes moved. He cleared the corner properly, checked his angles, controlled his muzzle. He did not check down. Casey was against the baseboard, below his sight line, folded into the shadow where the wall met a supply cart. She was small. She'd always been small. In the teams they had called her Ghost, not because she was fast, but because she could fold herself into spaces that did not look like they could hold a person. He took 2 steps past her. She rose behind him like something the floor had decided to give back. The syringe went into the lateral neck. She depressed the plunger before he could turn. Succinylcholine is not a sedative. It is a paralytic. Every muscle in his body would stop responding to voluntary command within 45 seconds. He would remain conscious. He would be unable to move, speak, or pull a trigger. He tried to swing the rifle. His arms were already too slow. She caught the barrel, redirected it toward the ceiling, and eased him to the floor as his legs folded. She looked into his eyes. He looked into hers. She put one finger to her lips. Then she took his rifle, checked the magazine, and moved toward room 417. The silence was the strangest part. Casey sat on the floor of the 4th floor corridor with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out in front of her, and for the first time in 97 minutes, nothing was moving. No boots, no gunfire, no alarms, just the hum of the backup generators and the slow, wet sound of her own breathing. Her scrubs were torn at the left shoulder, where the second man's knife had caught fabric instead of skin. Her knuckles were split across both hands. There was blood on her forearms that belonged to at least 3 different people. None of it hers, and she could feel the particular ache in her right wrist that meant she'd hyperextended it during the stairwell and hadn't noticed until now. She noticed now. Down the hall, General Webb was alive, still intubated, still sedated. His monitors beat their steady, indifferent rhythm as if nothing had happened, as if 10 armed men had not come to kill him, as if a nurse hadn't dismantled them floor by floor in the dark with IV poles and fire extinguishers and a violence so precise it barely left marks on the walls. The FBI arrived at 0519, then NCIS, then people in suits who didn't show credentials and didn't give names. Casey watched them come through the main entrance from where she sat. She did not stand up. She did not identify herself. A paramedic tried to check her vitals, and she let him take her pulse, and then asked him, quietly, to go help the patients on 3 who'd missed their 0400 medications. He looked at her like she was in shock. She wasn't in shock. She was doing the math on which patients needed what and in what order, because the night shift was now evidence and the day shift wasn't here yet, and someone had to make sure Daniel Okafor's surgical sites hadn't torn open when he'd used that IV pole on the man she'd sent his way. Okafor was fine. She checked him herself. He was sitting up in bed with the steel pole still across his lap, and a look on his face she recognized from men who had just survived something they did not yet have language for. He looked at her hands, at the blood, at the way she moved through the ward checking each patient with the same unhurried precision she'd used every other night he'd known her. "Who are you?" he asked again. She taped a fresh gauze pad over his IV site, adjusted his blanket, checked the drain on his left leg, and noted the output on his chart with a pen she'd pulled from her pocket, as if the pen had been there the whole time, as if it hadn't spent the last hour and a half tucked behind her ear while she cleared a building. "I'm your nurse," she said. She finished her charting. She completed her rounds. She checked every patient on the 3rd floor and then every patient on the 4th floor, and she documented everything in the system with timestamps and vitals and medication notes that were, when investigators reviewed them later, flawless. At 06:31, the day shift arrived. Casey gave report to the oncoming nurse. Her voice was steady. Her handoff was clean. She mentioned the power outage, the backup generator activation times, the adjusted medication schedule. She did not mention the 10 men. She walked out of Bethesda Naval Medical Center at 6:48 into a morning that was just beginning to go pale at the edges. The air was cold and smelled like wet concrete, and the particular nothing smell of a parking lot before the world fills it up with exhaust and noise and people. She got into her car, a 10-year-old Civic with a dent in the rear quarter panel and a hospital parking sticker on the windshield. She sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel. The split knuckles looked wrong against the steering wheel cover, which was soft gray fabric, the kind you buy at a gas station for $11. Then she started the engine and drove home. Nobody stopped her. Nobody knew.